Emma stood at the woodman gate of her childhood home, her fingers wrapped tightly around the old brass key. The metal felt cold against her palm, just like the emptiness in her chest. She had been holding onto this key for 3 weeks now, ever since the funeral director handed it to her with a sad smile. The small English village of Millbrook spread out before her like a painting from her memories. But something was different. Where Mrs. Baker's flower shop used to be, there was now a modern coffee shop with bright glass windows. The old post office had been replaced by a small grocery store with colorful signs. Young families with children walked past the stone cottages, their voices filling the air with laughter that felt foreign to Emma's ears. Her father, William, had lived in this same house for 67 years. He was born here, raised his family here, and 3 weeks ago, he had died here alone while Emma was hundreds of miles away in London. She had been so busy with her life as a primary school teacher, rushing from one lesson to another, grading papers late into the night, attending meetings and training sessions every weekend. She told herself she would visit him soon, every phone call that went unanswered. She promised herself she would call him back tomorrow, but tomorrow kept becoming next week, and next week became next month. Soon never came. Now it never would. Emma pushed open the gate with a soft creak that sounded exactly the same as it had when she was 7 years old. The small garden looked tired and overgrown. Her father's favorite roses needed trimming, and weeds had begun to take over the vegetable patch where he used to grow tomatoes and carrots. She could almost see him there, bent over his plants with his old gardening gloves, humming quietly to himself. The evening air was crisp and cool against her face as she decided to walk down Rosemary Lane. Instead of going straight into the empty house, this narrow street had been their special place when she was growing up. Every evening after dinner, when the dishes were washed and homework was finished, her father would take her hand, and they would walk this exact same path together. The lane stretched ahead of her like a ribbon of memories. The old cobblestones were still there, though some had been replaced with newer ones that looked too clean and bright. She remembered how her father would point to different houses and tell her stories about the families who lived there. He knew everyone's name, their children's ages, and their small troubles and joys. "See that blue door, Emma?" he would say in his gentle voice. "That's where Mr. and Mrs. Cooper live. They've been married for 50 years, and every morning he still brings her tea in bed." Or he would stop by the old oak trees and tell her about the day she was born. How he had walked this same path that night, too excited to sleep, wondering what kind of person his little daughter would become. The oak trees were still there, their thick branches reaching across the lane toward each other like old friends trying to hold hands. In the growing darkness, they looked exactly the same as they had 15 years ago. Their leaves rustled softly in the evening breeze, creating the same peaceful sound that used to make her feel so safe and loved. But now Emma felt completely alone. The weight of regret sat heavy on her shoulders like a thick winter coat she could not take off. Every step reminded her of conversations they never had, hugs she never gave, and phone calls she never made. She wished with all her heart that she could take just one more walk with him, to tell him how much those evening walks had meant to her, to say thank you for all his patience and kindness, to say sorry for being too busy to visit Dot as she walked. Neighbors' windows began to glow with warm yellow light. She could see families sitting together round dinner tables, children doing homework while parents cooked, couples watching television side by side. Everyone seemed to belong somewhere, to be part of something bigger than themselves. Emma had forgotten what that felt like. The lane curved gently toward the old stone bridge that crossed the small stream running through the village. She remembered feeding ducks there with her father, dropping pieces of bread into the water and watching the ducks paddle frantically to catch them. Her father would laugh at her excitement, his eyes crinkling at the corners the way they did when he was truly happy. By the time she reached the end of the lane and turned back toward home, full darkness had settled over Millbrook. Street lamps cast small pools of light along the path, and the air had grown even cooler. She pulled her jacket tight around herself and walked slowly back to the house that no longer felt like home. Standing at her father's front door, Emma wondered if coming back had been a terrible mistake. The house would be cold and quiet, filled with his belongings but empty of his presence. Maybe she should have just hired someone else to sell everything and never returned to this place where every cow and I held memories she was not ready to face. But the brass key was still in her hand, and tomorrow she would have to begin the difficult work of saying goodbye to her childhood home forever. The next evening, Emma found her feet carrying her toward Rosemary Lane without her even thinking about it. She had spent the entire day inside her father's house, sorting through his belongings and making phone calls to estate agents. The silence in the house had become too much to bear, pressing down on her like a heavy blanket she could not escape. Something invisible seemed to pull her toward the same path she and her father had walked together so many times. Maybe it was habit, or maybe it was hope that being there might make her feel closer to him somehow. The evening air was warmer than the night before, and a few early stars were beginning to appear in the darkening sky. As she walked slowly down the cobblestone lane, Emma noticed things she had missed the previous evening. Someone had planted new flowers in the small garden beds along the street. A cat sat washing itself on a windowsill, completely unbothered by her presence. The sound of her footsteps echoed softly between the old stone houses, creating a gentle rhythm that reminded her of her childhood. When she reached the old stone bridge that crossed the village stream, Emma saw she was not alone. An elderly man was sitting on the wooden bench that overlooked the water. She remembered this bench well because her father had helped build it when she was about 10 years old. He had been so proud of that bench, checking on it every few months to make sure it was still sturdy and comfortable for anyone who wanted to rest there. The man looked up as she approached, and Emma saw that he had kind blue eyes and silver hair that was neatly combed. His face was lined with wrinkles, but when he smiled, those lines seemed to tell stories of many years of happiness and laughter. "You must be Emma," he said in a warm voice that immediately made her feel welcome. "I'm Henry Fletcher. I live in the cottage with the red door, just down the lane from your father's house." Emma stopped walking and stared at him in surprise. She had not expected anyone in the village to remember her after so many years away. Most of the faces she had seen were strangers, and she had assumed she was a stranger to them as well. "Your father spoke of you often," Henry continued, using a wooden walking stick to help himself stand up from the bench. "He was always telling us about his daughter Emma, the teacher in London who was helping children learn to read and write." Emma felt her cheeks grow warm. She had no idea that her father talked about her to his neighbors. During their brief phone calls over the past few years, he had seemed more interested in hearing about her work than sharing news about his own life. Henry began walking slowly along the path, and Emma found herself walking beside him. His pace was gentle and unhurried, and she noticed that he moved carefully, as if his legs caused him some pain. But his smile never faded, and his presence felt comforting in a way she had not expected. "I've been taking these evening walks since my dear Margaret passed away last month," Henry explained as they walked under the oak trees. "We used to walk together every evening for 35 years. These old legs aren't what they used to be, but the walking helps with the loneliness. It makes me feel like she's still here with me somehow." Emma understood exactly what he meant. Walking this path made her feel closer to her father. even though he was gone. She wondered if that was why her feet had brought her here again tonight. As they continued along Rosemary Lane, Henry began sharing stories about her father that Emma had never heard before. His voice was full of warmth and affection as he spoke. "William was always helping someone in the village," Henry said, pointing toward a small cottage with yellow curtains. "Just last month, he spent an entire afternoon fixing Mrs. Thompson's garden gate. She's 83 years old and lives alone, and that gate had been broken for weeks. Your father noticed it during one of his walks and came back the next day with his toolbox." Emma listened with growing amazement. Her father had never mentioned helping Mrs. Thompson or anyone else in the village, and young Tom Bradley, Henry continued, gesturing toward a house where a bicycle was propped against the front wall. "That boy is 8 years old, and he was the only child in his class who couldn't ride a bike. His parents work such long hours that they didn't have time to teach him. Your father spent 3 weekends in the village park, running alongside that boy until he learned to balance and pedal by himself. He never told me about any of this," Emma said quietly, feeling confused and a little hurt. Why had her father shared these stories with Henry, but never with her? Henry stopped walking and turned to look at her with those kind blue eyes. "But he talked about you all the time," he said gently. "Every week. He would tell us something new about your teaching, about how proud he was that you were making such a difference in children's lives. He used to say that you got your caring nature from him, but your intelligence and determination were all your own." Henry paused and smiled even more warmly. "He kept every letter you sent him, you know. He had them in a special box on his kitchen table, and sometimes he would read parts of them to us. Not the private parts, of course, but the bits where you wrote about your students and your work." For the first time since her father's death 3 weeks ago, Emma felt a small warmth spreading through her chest. It was tiny, like the first hint of spring after a long winter, but it was real, and it was there. Over the next week, Emma and Henry's evening walks became as natural as breathing. Every day at 6 o'clock, she would find herself looking out her father's front window, waiting to see Henry walking slowly down the lane with his wooden stick. When she spotted his familiar figure, she would grab her jacket and step outside to meet him at the old stone bridge. Each evening brought new stories about her father that amazed Emma more and more. She was discovering that William had lived a much richer life in Millbrook than she had ever imagined, while she had been busy with her teaching career in London. Thinking her father spent his days quietly reading newspapers and tending his garden. He had actually been the heart of the village community. On their third walk together, Henry pointed toward the small red brick building that housed the village school. Emma remembered walking past it every day when she was young, but now it looked smaller than it had in her memories. Your father started a small reading group for the children there, Henry explained as they paused by the school gate. Every Thursday evening, he would unlock the school library and spend 2 hours reading stories to anyone who wanted to come. Sometimes there were only 3 or 4 children, but sometimes there were 15 or 20. Emma stared at the school building in wonder. "I had no idea he was doing that." "Oh yes," Henry continued, his eyes twinkling with fond memory. "He was particularly good with the children who struggled with reading. He had such patience with them, never making them feel embarrassed if they couldn't sound out a word. He would sit right beside them and help them work through each sentence, celebrating every small success." Henry chuckled and shook his head. "He used to tell us that teaching must run in the family. He said his daughter was a natural teacher, and maybe he had some of that gift too, even though he had never studied for it like you had." They continued walking, and Henry led her to a part of the village Emma had never seen before. Behind the old church, There was a beautiful memorial garden filled with roses, lavender, and small fruit trees. Stone pathways wound between the planted beds, and wooden benches were placed in quiet spots where people could sit and think. In the center of the garden stood a small bronze plaque mounted on a piece of local stone. Emma walked closer to read the words engraved there. In memory of those who plant seeds of kindness. Donated by William and Emma Fletcher in hope that beauty and love will continue to grow. Emma read the plaque 3 times, feeling more confused with each reading. "I don't remember donating anything for this garden," she said, turning to look at Henry with puzzled eyes. Henry chuckled softly. The same warm sound she was beginning to look forward to hearing each evening. "Your father created this memorial garden about 5 years ago. He used all the money you sent him for a birthday and Christmas gifts to pay for the plants and the stonework." Emma felt her breath catch in her throat. "But I sent him money so he could buy things he needed or wanted. He said he had everything he needed," Henry replied gently. "But he wanted to create something beautiful that would last long after he was gone. He told me that you would want something like this in the village, something that would help people feel peaceful and remember that kindness matters." Henry pointed to different sections of the garden as he spoke. "He planted the roses because he said they reminded him of your mother. The lavender was because you loved the smell when you were little. And those apple trees will give fruit to anyone who wants to pick some." Emma's eyes filled with tears. But for the first time since her father's death, they were not tears of pure sadness. Mixed in with her grief was something else, the warm feeling of being loved in ways she had never understood before. She was beginning to see her father's love not just in their shared memories of bedtime stories and evening walks, but in how he had carried their connection into every part of his daily life. As they continued their walk through the village, Emma noticed something else that surprised her. Every person they met greeted Henry with genuine warmth and affection. Mrs. Patterson stopped weeding her garden to chat with him about her grandchildren. Young Mr. Davis, who was washing his car, asked about Henry's arthritis and whether the new medicine was helping. The teenage girl working in the corner shop waved and called out that she had saved him the newspaper with the crossword puzzle he liked best. Emma realized that these evening walks were not just helping her heal from the loss of her father. They were also keeping Henry connected to his community during his own difficult time of grief. Since losing his wife Margaret, these daily walks and conversations were probably the main way he stayed in touch with other people. When they reached her father's gate at the end of their walk, Emma turned to face Henry. "Thank you for showing me who my father really was," she said, meaning every word. "I thought I knew him, but there was so much more." Henry smiled and patted her arm gently with his free hand. "Thank you for helping an old man remember that he's not alone in this world," he replied. "These walks with you have been the best part of my days." As Emma watched Henry continue slowly down the lane toward his cottage with the red door, she felt something she had not experienced in weeks, for the first time since her father's death. She was not dreading tomorrow. During their 4th evening walk together, Emma and Henry were making their usual way past the old stone church when they noticed something that made them both stop. On the wide steps leading up to the heavy wooden doors, a small figure sat hunched over with her head resting on her knees. As they got closer, Emma could see it was a young girl, probably about 10 years old. She had tangled brown hair that looked like it had not been brushed in days, and when she looked up at their approach, Emma saw the saddest green eyes she had ever seen. The child's clothes were clean but wrinkled, and she was holding a small backpack close to her chest as if it contained everything important in her world. Emma felt her heart immediately reach out to this lonely child. There was something about the way the girl sat so still and quiet that reminded Emma of herself at that age. during the difficult months after her mother had died, when she often felt lost and forgotten. "Hello?" "There," Emma said in the gentlest voice she could manage, approaching slowly so she would not frighten the child. "I'm Emma, and this is my friend Henry. What's your name?" The girl looked up at them with those big green eyes, and Emma could see she was trying to decide whether these two strangers were safe to talk to. After a long moment, she whispered so quietly they almost could not hear her. "Alice." Henry moved carefully to sit down on the stone steps beside Alice, using his walking stick to lower himself slowly. Emma sat on the other side of the girl, making sure to leave enough space so Alice would not feel trapped between them. "It's getting quite dark, Alice," Henry said kindly. "Are you waiting for someone?" Alice nodded and looked down at her shoes. "I'm waiting for my mum, but she's been gone for 3 hours now. She said she would be back by tea time, but tea time was a long time ago." Emma and Henry exchanged worried glances over the top of Alice's head. It was nearly 8 o'clock in the evening, and this child had been sitting alone on the church steps for hours. "Where did your mum go?" Emma asked gently. Alice's story came out slowly, in small pieces that broke Emma's heart. Her mother, Sarah, worked jobs to keep them in their small flat above the bakery. During the day, she cleaned offices in the next town over, and 3 evenings a week she worked at a restaurant that stayed open late. Alice spent most evenings alone, doing her homework by herself and making simple dinners of bread and cheese or tin soup. "Sometimes Mum doesn't come home until very late," Alice explained, her voice getting smaller and smaller. "I get scared in the flat by myself, so sometimes I come here to wait. The church feels safer than being alone upstairs." Emma felt familiar pain string in her chest. She remembered exactly what it felt like to be a frightened child, wondering if the grown-ups in her life would be there when she needed them, after her mother died. There had been many evenings when her father worked late at his job, and Emma would sit by the window watching for his car, worried that something terrible might happen and she would be left completely alone. But she also remembered how her father's patient presence had helped her through those dark and scary times. He never made her feel silly for being afraid. He would sit with her and talk about whatever was worrying her. And somehow his calm voice and gentle understanding made everything seem less frightening. "Alice," Emma said, "would you like to walk with us? We take this same route every evening, and we always end up back here by the church. If your mum comes looking for you, she'll find you right here." Alice looked up with hope beginning to shine in her green eyes. "Really? You wouldn't mind if I came with you?" "We would love the company," Henry said warmly. "Emma and I have been walking partners for several days now, and it would be wonderful to have a third member of our group." Alice nodded eagerly and stood up, slinging her backpack over her small shoulders. As they began walking down the familiar path of Rosemary Lane, Emma found herself doing something that felt completely natural. She began sharing stories about the village, just as her father had done with her when she was Alice's age. She pointed to the old mill wheel that had not turned in 50 years but still stood beside the stream like a piece of village history. "My father told me that we used to grind wheat into flour for all the families in Millbrook," Emma explained, and Alice listened with wide, interested eyes. They walked past the small pond where a family of ducks lived, and Emma showed Alice how the mother duck always swam at the front of the group, while her babies followed in a neat line behind her. "Those little ones hatched just last month," Emma said. "In a few more weeks, they'll be big enough to fly away and find their own pond." As they continued their walk, Emma pointed out the cottage where the village baker lived. The house with the climbing roses that bloomed every summer, and the spot where the old oak trees formed a natural archway over the lane. My father used to tell me that every place has stories. Emma said to Alice, and every person we meet has something to teach us. Alice smiled for the first time that evening, and Emma felt something important shift inside her heart. For the first time since her father's death, she was not thinking about her own grief and regret. Instead, she was thinking about how she could help this lonely child feel less afraid and forgotten. "Will you walk with me again tomorrow?" Alice asked hopefully as they completed their circuit and returned to the church steps. "Of course we will," Emma replied, and she meant it completely. 3 months later, Emma stood in the front room of her father's house, watching sunlight stream through the windows onto small desks and chairs she had ranged in a careful circle. The room that had once been her father's quiet sitting area, filled with his favorite armchair and stacks of books, had been transformed into something entirely new. She had made a life-changing decision that surprised everyone, including herself. Instead of selling the house and returning to her busy life in London, she had decided to stay in Millbrook permanently. The decision had not been easy. She had to leave her teaching position at the London school where she had worked for 8 years. She had to sell her small flat and say goodbye to friends who could not understand why she wanted to move to Quiet Village. But something deep inside her heart told her this was exactly where she belonged. Emma had converted the front room into a small community space where she now offered after-school tutoring for local children. The walls were decorated with colorful posters showing the alphabet and multiplication tables. A bookshelf in the corner held storybooks and textbooks for different ages. A small table by the window was covered with art supplies, puzzles, and educational games. Alice had been her first regular student, of course, every day after school. The 10-year-old would arrive with her backpack and a smile that had grown brighter and more confident over the past few months. Alice's mother, Sarah, had been amazed by the change in her daughter, the frightened, lonely child who used to sit on church steps had become a happy girl who loved learning and looked forward to spend in time with Emma every afternoon. But Alice was no longer the only child who came to Emma's tutoring sessions. Word had spread quickly through the small village that William's daughter had returned and was helping children with their homework. Soon, other parents began bringing their children to the house on Rosemary Lane. There was 8-year-old Tom, the same boy her father had taught to ride a bicycle. Tom struggled with reading, but he loved when Emma read adventure stories aloud, and his confidence had grown tremendously. There was shy Mary, who was excellent at mathematics but too nervous to speak up in her regular classroom. There was energetic James, who had trouble sitting still but could focus perfectly when Emma gave him hands-on projects to work with. Henry had become an essential part of their little learning community. The elderly man would arrive every afternoon at 4 o'clock, walking slowly with his wooden stick, but always carrying interesting stories to share. He had found new energy and purpose in mentoring the young ones. Henry would sit in the comfortable chair by the fireplace and read stories aloud while Emma helped individual children with their homework. His gentle voice and endless patience reminded Emma so much of her father that sometimes she had to blink back tears. But Henry did more than just read stories. He shared his knowledge of the village's history, telling the children about how Millbrook had looked 50 years ago, about the families who had lived in their houses before them, and about the changes he had witnessed over his long lifetime. The children were fascinated by his tales, and they began to see their village as a place full of interesting stories rather than just a boring small town. Their evening walks had grown as well. What had started as a simple routine between Emma and Henry had become something much larger and more meaningful. Every evening at 6 o'clock, A small group would gather at the old stone bridge and set off together down Rosemary Lane. Mrs. Thompson had joined them after her husband's funeral 2 months ago. The 83-year-old woman had been struggling with loneliness and sadness, but the evening walks and the company of others who understood grief had helped her begin to heal. She often brought small treats from her kitchen to share with the children, and they loved hearing her stories about the village in the old days. Young Tom came with his pence on weekends, proud to show them the route he had learned by heart. Several other villagers had discovered the healing power of shared steps and shared stories. There was Mr. Davis, who had recently retired and was feeling lost without his daily work routine. There was teenage Sophie, who was nervous about starting at a new school and found comfort in the steady rhythm of walking with people who cared about her. As they walked down Rosemary Lane on this particular evening, Emma looked round at their little group and felt her heart fill with happiness. Alice was skipping ahead with Mary and James, the three children chatting excitedly about a project they were working on together. Henry was walking slowly beside Mrs. Thompson, listening patiently as she told him about a letter she had received from her grandson. Tom's parents were pointing out different flowers and birds to their son, helping him practice the nature words Emma had been teaching him. Emma realized that her father's legacy was living on through these connections. The path they had once walked together as father and daughter had become a journey of healing for an entire community. Every evening, as their little group made their way along the familiar route, she could feel her father's spirit of kindness and generosity continuing to touch new lives. "I used to think I had lost my father," Emma told Henry as they paused to watch Alice help a younger child tie his shoelace. "But now I understand that he's still with me every time I choose to help someone else." Henry nodded wisely, his blue eyes twinkling with understanding. "Love doesn't end when someone leaves us, Emma. It finds new ways to grow and spread, like seeds carried by the wind." Emma looked up at the old oak trees, their branches still reaching across the lane like old friends holding hands. She was no longer walking alone, and neither was anyone else in their growing group.